His heart stopped on August 16th, 1977. That's the official story. The Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was found unconscious on his bathroom floor in Graceland. He was 42 years old. The world stopped. Millions mourned. The music felt like it had died too. But what if the story we all know is just the beginning? What if the man himself didn't stop? In the days and weeks that followed, something strange started happening. The phones inside Graceland, the very house where he died, started to ring. Not with incoming calls, but with outgoing ones. 17 of them, to be exact. 17 mysterious calls made from a dead man's home. Who was making them? And more importantly, who were they calling? The official record is sealed, the house was supposed to be empty, and the man was gone. Or was he? Number 17 was the first call a test. The first call was quiet. It wasn't a dramatic announcement. It wasn't a cry for help. It was subtle, almost a whisper. The story, as pieced together by researchers and believers, suggests the call went to a close friend, someone who would recognize the voice instantly. The person on the other end heard a familiar drawl, a voice they thought they'd never hear again. The message was brief. It was something along the lines of, "This is John. It's done. I'm safe." And then, a click. The line went dead. And John Burroughs was a name Elvis used for decades. It was his go-to alias for booking hotels, flights, and doctor's appointments. It was the name he used when he wanted to be a normal person, not the king. Using that name was a signal. It was a secret handshake over the phone line, meant only for the inner circle. This first call, according to the theory, wasn't about a long conversation. It was a probe, a test. Could a call be made from inside Graceland without anyone noticing? Was the line secure? Were authorities listening in? The mansion was a chaotic scene after August 16th. It was swarming with family, staff, and a few officials, but it was also a fortress of grief. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, was in charge. He was a man broken by the loss of his son. The theory posits that the call had to be made from a specific phone, one in Elvis's private upstairs area, an area Vernon sealed off from almost everyone. Author Gail Brewer Giorgio became the central figure in documenting these claims. In her 1988 book, Is Elvis Alive?, she presented what she claimed was evidence of a massive cover-up. She argued that Elvis, tired of his fame and fearing for his life from mob connections, faked his own death with the help of a few loyal friends and possibly federal agents. The first call was the signal that phase one of the plan was complete. He had successfully deed. The context of 1977 is important. Phone technology wasn't what it is today. There was no caller ID for the average person. Tracing a call was a serious official process. A brief call from a local number wouldn't raise any alarms. It was the perfect way to send a message under the radar. The person who received the call was reportedly sworn to secrecy, told that speaking out would endanger the entire operation. This adds a layer of conspiracy that is impossible to prove or disprove. The story relies entirely on anonymous sources and secondhand accounts, which is a common thread in the entire Elvis is Alive saga. But the idea of a test call makes a strange kind of sense. If you were going to pull off the biggest disappearance in modern history, you wouldn't start with a press conference. You'd start small, you'd check your lines of communication, you'd make sure your network was secure. The first call was the first pebble dropped in the water, creating ripples that are still felt today. But what if the call was nothing more than a cruel prank or a misunderstanding in a time of intense grief? Could a Graceland staff member, trying to be helpful, have made the call? And if Elvis really was alive and in hiding, why risk using a phone at Graceland at all? Why not use a payphone miles away? The questions surrounding this first alleged call are foundational to the entire mystery. What evidence beyond a secondhand story exists to prove this first call ever happened? If the recipient was sworn to secrecy, how did the story get out in the first place? And if it was a test, did it pass? Number 16, who was on the other end of the line? The calls didn't go to random people. They weren't placed to radio stations or newspapers. According to the legend, the 17 calls targeted a very specific, very small group of people. These were individuals from Elvis's inner circle, but not necessarily the ones you'd think. They weren't all members of the Memphis Mafia, the famous entourage that surrounded Elvis. Some were, but others were more discreet figures in his life. A former girlfriend he still trusted, a distant cousin who managed some of his personal affairs, a sound engineer who knew his voice better than almost anyone. The common denominator was loyalty. These were people Elvis believed would keep a secret no matter what. The content of the calls varied. Some were short and cryptic, like the first one. "I'm okay. Don't talk to the press. The package has been delivered." Others were reportedly more emotional. One call was allegedly made to a woman Elvis had loved years before. The voice on the other end didn't say much, but he let a specific song play in the background, a song that only the two of them would understand the significance of. It was a message delivered through music, something Elvis had done his entire life. Another call was supposedly more practical, concerning the transfer of a specific asset, a financial loose end that needed tying up. The caller used jargon and nicknames that only the true Elvis and the recipient would know. Gail Brewer Giorgio's research suggests these people were chosen because they were on the periphery of the media circus. The press was hounding the big names: Priscilla Presley, Vernon Presley, Joe Esposito. They weren't looking at a quiet cousin in Mississippi or a retired sound tech in Nashville. These people could receive a call without it immediately becoming a headline. They were the perfect nodes in a secret communication network. The fear of exposure was immense. These people were told that if the story got out, not only would Elvis's life be in danger, but their own lives could be at risk. This narrative of a hidden network of loyalists is compelling because it mirrors the way Elvis operated in life. He kept different circles of friends separate. He compartmentalized his world. It stands to reason that if he planned his own death, he would use this same strategy. The psychological pressure on these supposed recipients must have been enormous. Imagine hearing the voice of a man the entire world believed was dead. You would question your own sanity. You would be torn between loyalty and the sheer unbelievability of the situation. This is why many of them, according to the story, never spoke publicly. Their silence is presented not as proof of a hoax, but as proof of their unwavering loyalty. The few fragments of stories that have emerged came out years later, often through third parties, making them impossible to verify. A friend of the cousin, a nephew of the sound engineer. The stories are always just out of reach of solid proof. The skeptics point out the obvious problem. Without a single named individual coming forward with a credible, verifiable story, the entire claim is just hearsay. It's a powerful myth, but it lacks a human face. It's easy to say a former girlfriend was called. It's much harder to provide her name, the date of the call, and a phone record. But the believers have an answer for that. They say the identities are kept secret to protect them and to protect Elvis. The lack of evidence becomes, in a strange way, evidence of the conspiracy's success. So, if these calls were real, why have none of the 17 recipients ever broken their silence in a verifiable way? Are they all still, after all these decades, protecting a secret? Or were the people who received these calls simply the victims of a cruel, elaborate hoax, too embarrassed or confused to admit they were fooled? And who would have the intimate knowledge of Elvis's life to pull off such a targeted and personal series of pranks? Number 15. Could anyone have made those calls? The immediate aftermath of Elvis's death saw Graceland transform. It went from a home to a shrine, a crime scene, and a command center all at once. The official story is that the upstairs area, Elvis's private sanctuary, was sealed almost immediately on the orders of his father, Vernon. This is a key point. The phones from which the mysterious calls were allegedly made were located in this sealed-off area. So, the question is simple. Could an unauthorized person have gotten up there? The security at Graceland, even in 1977, was significant. But it was geared toward keeping people out, not in. The house was full of family members, close friends, and longtime staff. The atmosphere was one of chaos, shock, and overwhelming grief. In that kind of environment, normal procedures break down. People were coming and going. Doors were left unlocked. Attention was focused on the funeral arrangements and managing the massive crowds gathering at the gates. Someone with intimate knowledge of the house's layout, like a trusted member of the staff or a family member, could have potentially slipped upstairs unnoticed. The chaos could have provided the perfect cover. Let's consider the layout. The main phone line for the house was in the kitchen, a hub of activity, but Elvis had private lines installed in his office and his bedroom suite upstairs. These were the phones he used for his personal and business calls, the ones he used to run his world from the comfort of his own bubble. These were the phones that offered privacy, If someone wanted to make a series of secret calls, these were the instruments they would use. The theory that Elvis himself made the calls hinges on him hiding somewhere within the vast mansion, or on its grounds for a short period after his death, waiting for the right moment to use the phones before disappearing for good. Another possibility is that an accomplice made the calls. This accomplice would have to be someone with unquestioned access to the entire house, someone who wouldn't arouse suspicion by being in the upstairs area. Only a handful of people fit this description. Vernon Presley is the most obvious candidate, or perhaps a member of the Memphis Mafia who was in on the plan. This person would not only need access, but also the nerve to carry out such a task while the world's media was focused on that very house. The official response from the Graceland estate and those who were there is that the upstairs was completely locked down. They maintained that no one, aside from Vernon and a select few, went up there. They dismissed the claims of phone calls as fantasy born from grief and a desire to keep the legend alive. They point to the lack of any phone records. Of course, local calls in 1977 were not itemized on phone bills the way they are today. A record of a local call being made would likely not exist, making the claim impossible to definitively disprove through billing statements. The entire question of access is a cornerstone of the mystery. If you believe the official account, the calls are impossible. If you believe that, in the fog of grief and chaos, security was more lax than anyone remembers, then a window of opportunity opens. The calls become plausible, even if not proven. The state of the house, the emotional turmoil, the sheer number of people with some level of access, plus it all creates a gray area where a determined person could have acted in secret. So, was the ceiling of the upstairs a immediate, impenetrable lockdown, or was it a more porous boundary in the initial hours and days? Could a longtime employee, loyal to Elvis, have been the one to make the calls on his behalf? And if security was so tight, how do we explain other anomalies reported from the house in those first few days? Number 14. What did the voice on the tape really say? This is where the story moves from whispered rumors to something you can actually hear. In 1981, a recording surfaced that proponents of the Elvis is alive theory claimed was a phone conversation with Elvis Presley himself recorded years after his supposed death. The tape was championed by Gail Brewer Giorgio and became the centerpiece of her argument. On it, a man with a slow southern drawl, sounding tired and older, discusses his life in hiding. He talks about his love for his fans, his reasons for disappearing, and his hopes for the future. The voice is eerily similar to Elvis's. It has the same cadence, the same unique patterns of speech. For believers, this was the smoking gun. It was audible proof. The man on the tape never says, "I am Elvis Presley." He's cautious. He speaks in riddles and illusions. He talks about the image and the difficulty of living up to it. He mentions needing to take care of some business back in 1977. He sounds like a man in exile, reflecting on a life he was forced to leave behind. The conversation is rambling and emotional. At one point, the voice cracks. He talks about wanting to see his daughter, Lisa Marie. It's a powerful and persuasive performance, if that's what it is. And voice print analysis was conducted on the tape. The results were predictably controversial. An analyst hired by Brewer Giorgio, a man named Lowell Stryker, claimed there was a high probability that the voice on the tape was Elvis. Other independent analysts, however, were far more skeptical. They pointed out that voice print analysis is not as reliable as fingerprinting, and that a skilled impersonator could fool the technology of the day. This brings us to the man known as Orion. In the late 1970s, a masked singer named Orion appeared on the music scene. His voice was a dead ringer for Elvis's. He sang on Sun Records, Elvis's original label. He moved like Elvis. The mystery of his identity fueled his brief career. It was later revealed that Orion was a singer named Jimmy Ellis, an artist who had been told his entire life that he sounded too much like Elvis to ever be a star in his own right. After Elvis's death, that similarity became his ticket to fame. Skeptics believe that the voice on the infamous 1981 tape is not Elvis, but Jimmy Ellis. Ellis himself was cagey about his involvement, enjoying the mystery. He never definitively confirmed or denied making the recording, which only added to the legend. The content of the tape is also revealing. The man speaks about events and feelings, but he's short on specific, verifiable facts that only Elvis would know. He talks in generalities about his past and his decision to leave. A clever hoaxer, armed with the many biographies and interviews available, could have scripted the entire conversation. The emotional weight of the recording seems to be its most powerful feature. It's what convinces people. It feels real. It taps into the public's desire for Elvis to be the sensitive, thoughtful man they always hoped he was, not the tragic figure of his final years. The tape remains a deeply divisive piece of evidence. To listen to it is to be confronted with a genuine mystery. Is it a grieving man finally telling his story? Or is it the masterpiece of a talented impersonator, a calculated deception that launched 1,000 conspiracy theories? What specific phrases on the tape have been most heavily scrutinized by voice analysts? If it was Jimmy Ellis, what was his motivation for participating in such a hoax? And where is the original, unedited master recording of that phone call today? Number 13, why would he use a code name? John Burroughs. The name is central to the entire legend of Elvis's survival. It wasn't a name invented by conspiracy theorists. It was Elvis's own creation, his favorite and most frequently used alias. He used it to book hotels to avoid mobs of fans. He used it to check into hospitals for his various health issues. He even reportedly had credit cards and a driver's license under the name. It was his escape hatch from his own identity. So when the voice on the phone in those first mysterious calls allegedly identified himself as John, it was a powerful signal to those who knew. It was a way of saying, it's me, without actually saying his name. The use of the alias is a double-edged sword for the theory. On one hand, it adds a layer of authenticity. A random prankster might not know about this specific, personally significant alias. It suggests a level of insider knowledge. It was a detail that resonated with fans and researchers who had studied Elvis's life. It wasn't Mr. Smith or John Doe. It was his name, the name of his alter ego. In her book, Gail Brewer Giorgio emphasizes the importance of the Burroughs alias, presenting it as a key piece of the puzzle, a breadcrumb left intentionally by Elvis to let his trusted few know he was alive and the plan was in motion. On the other hand, the use of the alias is also somewhat illogical if total secrecy was the goal. By 1977, the name John Burroughs was not a perfect secret. Members of the press and many dedicated fans knew about it. Using it could actually draw attention rather than deflect it. If you were truly in a federal witness protection program, as some versions of the theory claim, you would be assigned a new, completely random name. You wouldn't be allowed to use your old, well-known alias. This suggests that if the calls happened, they weren't part of an official, government-sanctioned disappearance. It was a private operation run by Elvis and his own team. This leads to a deeper question about the motive behind the calls. Were they purely functional, meant to convey information, or were they also psychological? Was Elvis, or whoever was making the calls, playing a game, dropping clues? It's been suggested that Elvis, a man who loved games and mysteries, couldn't resist leaving a trail. He was a showman, even in his own death. The use of John Burroughs was a wink and a nod, a piece of theater for a very select audience. The history of the alias itself is interesting. Elvis reportedly started using it in the 1960s. Some say he got the name from a character in a movie, others say it was the name of a distant relative. Whatever its origin, he used it consistently for over a decade. There are documented hotel receipts and flight manifests bearing the name. This is not a matter of debate. The name was real. Its appearance in the narrative of the phone calls is what grounds the story in a verifiable fact, making the more unbelievable parts of the tale seem more plausible. So, was using John Burroughs a brilliant way to authenticate a secret message or a foolish mistake that could have exposed the entire operation? Did the use of the name convince the recipients that the calls were real, or did it make them suspect they were being targeted by a very knowledgeable prankster? And if he had a whole new identity waiting for him, why cling to a piece of his old life? Number 12, did the handwriting match? The mystery didn't stop with phone calls. In the years following 1977, other forms of communication allegedly surfaced. This included handwritten notes, letters, and even annotations in books that were supposedly sent by Elvis from hiding. These documents, like the phone calls, often used code words and inside references. But unlike a voice on a tape, handwriting could be scientifically analyzed. This brought a new dimension to the investigation. One of the most famous pieces of evidence is the so-called afterlife handwriting. A note, supposedly written by Elvis in his own hand after his death, was included in the original edition of Gail Brewer Giorgio's book. It was a tantalizing piece of physical evidence. Brewer Giorgio and other believers sought out handwriting experts to analyze these samples. They compared them to known examples of Elvis's handwriting from letters and signed documents from before 1977. One of the most prominent experts to weigh in was Paul Wiest, a respected graphologist. He and others concluded that there were significant similarities. They pointed to the unique loops, the pressure of the pen, the spacing of the letters. They argued that the handwriting showed signs of stress and aging, but that the core characteristics matched. They declared it a high probability that the man who wrote the notes after 1977 was the same man who wrote the notes before 1977. This, for many, was more compelling than the voice on the tape. Handwriting is considered a more unique and difficult to forge biometric than a voice. A skilled forger could copy a signature, but replicating pages of natural, free-flowing handwriting with all its subtle nuances is incredibly difficult. The believers presented this expert analysis as near irrefutable proof. They had science on their side. However, just as with the voice analysis, there was a great deal of controversy. Other handwriting experts came to the opposite conclusion. They dismissed the analysis of Wiest and others, claiming they were biased or using flawed methodologies. These skeptical experts argued that the afterlife samples were clumsy forgeries. They pointed out inconsistencies in letter formation and a lack of the natural flow seen in Elvis's authentic writing. They suggested that a dedicated fan, having studied Elvis's handwriting for years, could have produced a convincing, but ultimately fake, sample. The debate highlights a fundamental issue in the field of forensic document examination. It is often more of an art than a hard science. Different experts looking at the same documents can come to wildly different conclusions based on their experience and interpretation. There is no single objective test that can say with 100% certainty who wrote a particular note. This left the public in the middle of a battle of the experts. Who do you believe? The expert who says it's a match, or the expert who says it's a fake? The content of the notes was similar to the phone calls. They were often philosophical and reflective, speaking of a spiritual journey and a new sense of peace. They were filled with the kind of language Elvis was known to use, referencing his interest in numerology and spiritual books. This again raised the question, was this the real Elvis or a forger who had done their homework? What specific handwriting characteristics were the points of greatest contention between the dueling experts? Were the documents ever subjected to ink and paper analysis to determine their age? And if the notes were real, why risk sending a physical object that could be traced and analyzed when a phone call was so much more ephemeral? Number 11. What does psychology say about mass belief? To understand why the story of the 17 phone calls and the survival of Elvis persists, we have to look beyond the evidence. We have to look at the human brain. Why are we as a species so drawn to conspiracy theories? And why was the death of this particular celebrity so hard for so many to accept? The answer lies in psychology. The death of a beloved public figure, especially a sudden one, creates a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. This is a term in psychology that refers to the mental discomfort experienced when holding two or more contradictory beliefs. In this case, the two beliefs are Elvis was larger than life, an immortal icon, and Elvis is dead from a mundane, slightly embarrassing health problem. These two ideas don't sit well together. The human mind seeks to resolve this dissonance. One way to do that is to reject the official story. It's easier to believe in a grand conspiracy of a faked death, a secret life, a man escaping his own fame than it is to accept the simple, tragic reality. The conspiracy theory provides a more satisfying narrative. It restores Elvis to his heroic status. He isn't a victim of his own excess, he's the master of his own destiny, a clever man who outsmarted the world. Dr. Alan D. Hart, a sociologist who has studied fan culture, noted that for many, Elvis wasn't just a singer, he was a quasi-religious figure. His death felt like a personal loss, like the death of a family member. In the face of such grief, denial is a powerful and common coping mechanism. The phenomenon is not unique to Elvis. Similar theories have sprung up around the deaths of other icons like James Dean, Jim Morrison, and Tupac Shakur. The pattern is always the same: a charismatic figure, a sudden or confusing death, and a refusal by the public to let go. The Elvis is Alive movement was just the biggest and most enduring of them all. This was fueled by the media landscape of the time. The rise of tabloid newspapers in the late 1970s and 1980s provided the perfect platform for these theories. The papers, like the Weekly World News, ran sensational headlines about Elvis sightings for years, keeping the story in the public consciousness. There's also the element of collective memory. Like, people who were there remember the shock and confusion of August 1977. The story of the phone calls, the sightings, the tapes, it all becomes part of the shared memory of that event. Even for those who don't fully believe, the story is an inseparable part of the Elvis legend. And it's a testament to his incredible impact on the culture. He was so big in life that, for many, he simply couldn't be contained by death. The belief in his survival is a way of keeping his spirit, his energy, and his rebellion alive. It's a refusal to let the music stop. So, is the belief in the 17 phone calls less about evidence and more about a collective psychological need? Does the endurance of this myth say more about us than it does about Elvis Presley? And if we can be so easily convinced by a story that fits our emotional needs, what does that say about our ability to discern fact from fiction in other areas of our lives? Number 10. Was Vernon Presley in on it? In the center of the storm following Elvis's death stood his father, Vernon Presley. He was a quiet, unassuming man suddenly thrust into the biggest spotlight in the world. His public image was that of a grieving father devastated by the loss of his only son. But in the world of the Elvis is alive theory, Vernon plays a much more complex and mysterious role. Believers don't see him as just a grieving father, they see him as the gatekeeper of the secret, the man who helped his son pull off the ultimate disappearing act. The evidence for this is circumstantial, based on interpretations of his words and actions in the days following August 16th. Vernon was the one who took control of Graceland, he was the one who sealed the upstairs, he was the one who managed the immediate aftermath. If Elvis needed to hide in the house for a day or two, make his phone calls, and then slip away, Vernon was in the perfect position to make that happen. He could have created a pocket of privacy amidst the chaos, ensuring no one went into certain rooms, buying his son the precious time he needed. Then, there are his public statements. In interviews, Vernon often seemed hesitant, his words carefully chosen. Believers point to a famous quote where he allegedly told a reporter something to the effect of, "My son is not dead, he's just asleep." Officially, this is interpreted as a father speaking metaphorically about his son's spirit. But for the conspiracy theorists, it was a literal statement, a slip of the tongue revealing the truth. He also made cryptic comments about the official cause of death, suggesting there was more to the story than the public was being told. He was instrumental in having the full autopsy report sealed for 50 years, a decision that has fueled speculation ever since. Why seal the report if there was nothing to hide? Vernon's own health was failing, or he died just 2 years after his son in 1979. This is also seen as significant by theorists. Some believe he held on just long enough to ensure Elvis's new life was secure, and that the estate was in order. His death meant that one of the key players in the conspiracy was gone, his secrets taken with him to the grave. His behavior in those 2 years is scrutinized. He seemed to carry an immense burden, but was it just grief or the weight of a world-changing secret? Skeptics offer a much simpler explanation. Vernon Presley was an elderly man in poor health who had just experienced the most profound trauma of his life. His son, the center of his world, was gone. Of course he was distraught. Of course his statements were sometimes confusing or contradictory. He was in shock. His decision to seal the autopsy report could be seen as an act of a father protecting his son's privacy and dignity even in death. He didn't want the world to pick over the sordid details of Elvis's final years and health problems. It was an act of love, not a cover-up. The immense stress of losing his son and dealing with the global media frenzy likely hastened his own death. Vernon's role remains one of the most debated aspects of the entire mystery. Was he a heartbroken father trying to navigate an impossible situation, or was he the loyal and courageous accomplice in the greatest secret of the 20th century? Why did Vernon wait to have the casket moved to the meditation garden at Graceland? Was his control over the estate's narrative a sign of a cover-up, or just a father trying to protect his son's legacy? And what secrets, if any, did he share with his family in his final days? Number 9. How did the Elvis is Alive movement start? The story of the 17 phone calls didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was part of a larger, grassroots phenomenon, the Elvis is Alive movement. This movement didn't start with a single book or a TV show. It started as whispers among fans. It began in the weeks and months after his death, fueled by a collection of anomalies, strange coincidences, and a deep-seated refusal to accept the official story. One of the first seeds of doubt was the funeral itself. People who saw Elvis in his open casket at Graceland started talking. Some said the body didn't look right. It looked waxy, like a mannequin. The nose seemed different. The sideburns looked pasted on. Could it have been a wax dummy in the coffin? This theory, however unlikely, took root. Then there was the misspelling on his tombstone. His middle name, Oran, was spelled Aaron. While Elvis had used both spellings during his life, the official Aaron was a later preference. Believers claimed the real Elvis would never have allowed his original beloved spelling of Aaron to be changed on his final resting place. This, they said, was a deliberate clue, a sign that the grave was not his. The media played a huge role. In the late 1970s, the tabloid press was exploding in popularity. They found that stories about Elvis sold magazines. And stories about Elvis being alive sold even more. The first major sighting was reported in Kalamazoo, Michigan in 1981. A man who looked remarkably like an older, heavier Elvis was spotted at a local Burger King. A photograph was taken. It was blurry and inconclusive, but it became iconic. The sighting snowballed from there. He was seen in a supermarket in Louisiana. He was spotted as an extra in the movie Home Alone. Each sighting was a headline, keeping the myth alive and growing. Fan clubs, which had once been for celebrating his music, began to transform. Some became forums for investigating his death. Newsletters were published, sharing the latest sightings, theories, and evidence. It was a pre-internet, analog version of the online conspiracy forums we see today. People felt like they were part of a secret club. Piecing together a puzzle the rest of the world was too blind to see. They were the true, loyal fans, the ones who kept the faith. It was into this fertile ground that Gail Brewer Giorgio's book, Is Elvis Alive? 17 phone calls, the voice on the tape, the handwriting analysis, it was all there. The book gave the movement a Bible. It provided a structured argument that believers could point to. It lent an air of journalistic legitimacy to what had been, until then, just a collection of rumors. The book's success spawned TV specials, more books, and endless debate, cementing the Elvis is alive theory as a permanent fixture in American pop culture. So was the movement a genuine grassroots search for the truth, or was it a phenomenon created and sustained by a media that profited from the public's grief and fascination? How did a collection of small anomalies combine to create such a powerful and enduring myth? And without the rise of the tabloid press, would the Elvis is alive theory have ever become more than just a passing rumor? Number 8. Who was Gail Brewer Giorgio? You can't talk about the mystery of the phone calls without talking about Gail Brewer Giorgio. She is, for all intents and purposes, the architect of the modern Elvis is alive theory. Before her, there were rumors and sightings. After her, there was a narrative, complete with evidence, expert testimony, and a coherent plot. But who was she? And what were her motivations? Gail Brewer Giorgio was not a tabloid journalist or a superfan. She was a novelist and author from Georgia. Her journey into this mystery began, she claims, by accident. In the early 1980s, she was researching a novel about a famous Southern singer who fakes his own death to escape the pressures of fame. The novel, titled Orion, was published in 1979. It told the story of a rock and roll star who did exactly what Elvis is alleged to have done. After Elvis's actual death, she claimed that people started contacting her, telling her that her fictional story was in fact true. She says she was approached by sources with inside knowledge who wanted to get the real story out. This led her to write her non-fiction expose, Is Elvis Alive?, published in 1988. The book was a blockbuster. It laid out the case in detail, the motive, fear of the mob, burnout, the method of faked death using a look-alike or wax dummy, and the evidence, the phone calls, the tape, the handwriting. Brewer Giorgio presented herself not as a believer but as a journalist investigating a credible tip. She filled the book with expert opinions and detailed analysis, giving it a weight that previous tabloid stories lacked. She was a compelling and articulate spokesperson for the theory, appearing on numerous TV shows like Larry King Live and Oprah. Her motivations have always been a subject of debate. To her supporters, she is a courageous truth seeker, a woman who stumbled upon the biggest story of the century and refused to back down, despite ridicule from the mainstream media. They see her as Elvis's champion, the one person willing to listen to the evidence. To her detractors, she is a masterful opportunist. They argue that she saw the public's unwillingness to let Elvis go and cleverly packaged existing rumors into a best-selling book. They point out that she has profited immensely from the Elvis is alive industry she helped create. It's also important to note the controversy surrounding her and the singer Orion Jimmy Ellis. Skeptics claim that Brewer Giorgio was well aware of Ellis and may have even used him to create the evidence, such as the infamous 1981 audio tape. She has always denied this, maintaining that the voice on her tape is Elvis Presley. The relationship between her fictional novel Orion and the real-life masked singer Orion is a tangled web that adds another layer of intrigue to her story. Did her fiction inspire the real-life hoax, or did she uncover a truth that was stranger than fiction? Regardless of her motives, her impact is undeniable. She organized the scattered pieces of the myth into a powerful story. She gave a voice and a platform to the believers. The story of the 17 phone calls and the entire Elvis is alive phenomenon would likely be a forgotten piece of pop culture history if not for the work of Gail Brewer Giorgio. Was Gail Brewer Giorgio a genuine investigator who was stonewalled by the establishment, or a brilliant novelist who saw an opportunity to blur the line between fiction and reality? What was the full extent of her relationship with Jimmy Ryan Ellis, and why did her sources, who allegedly risked so much to come to her, never reveal their identities? Number 7, what about the sightings? The 17 phone calls are the audible part of the mystery. The sightings are the visual. For many believers, the two are inextricably linked. The calls were Elvis reaching out to his trusted few, while the sightings were accidental glimpses of the man himself, proof that he was out there living a quiet, anonymous life. The sheer number and variety of sightings reported since 1977 are staggering. He's been seen everywhere, from a gas station in Oregon to an airport in Argentina. The most famous sighting, as mentioned, was at a Burger King in Kalamazoo, Michigan. But there were others that captured the public imagination. There was the photo of a man who looked like Elvis in the background of a group shot of Muhammad Ali in 1984. There was the claim that Elvis had a small, uncredited role as a baggage handler in the 1990 movie Home Alone. The fans poured over the scene frame by frame, convinced the bearded man in the background was their hero. Each sighting was a media event, analyzed on TV shows and debated in magazines. These sightings provided a kind of triangulation for the believers. The calls proved he was alive, and the sightings proved he was out and about. The descriptions of the man in the sightings often matched the narrative. He was older, heavier, sometimes with a beard or graying hair. He was trying to blend in, but his iconic features were just too recognizable. Proponents of the theory argue that it would be impossible for so many different people in so many different places to all be mistaken or lying. The sheer volume of sightings, they claim, is evidence in itself. The skeptical explanation is, of course, far more mundane. It rests on a combination of factors: wishful thinking, mistaken identity, and the prevalence of Elvis impersonators. By the 1980s, Elvis impersonators were a global phenomenon. There were thousands of them, of all shapes and sizes. It's statistically inevitable that some of these impersonators, or just men who happen to bear a passing resemblance to Elvis, would be spotted in public. The human brain is also wired to see patterns. If you are actively looking for Elvis, you are more likely to interpret a random person with black hair and sideburns as a potential sighting. This is a psychological phenomenon known as confirmation bias. The Home Alone sighting is a perfect example. The director of the film, Chris Columbus, has publicly stated that the man in the scene was just an extra and has debunked the theory multiple times, but it still persists. Once an idea like that takes hold, it's very difficult to dislodge with facts. The sightings are about faith, not proof. They are moments of connection for the fans, a way of feeling like Elvis is still with us. Each blurry photo, each anecdotal story, adds another chapter to the myth. So why have none of the thousands of alleged sightings ever been confirmed with a clear, undeniable photograph or video? With the rise of camera phones in the 21st century, why did the credible sightings suddenly stop? And could some of the sightings have been deliberately staged by impersonators who enjoyed the publicity? Number 6, could it have been an impersonator? This is perhaps the simplest and most powerful counter-argument to the entire Elvis is alive saga, the impersonator theory. It suggests that the phone calls, the voice on the tape, and many of the sightings were not the work of Elvis Presley, but of one or more highly skilled Elvis impersonators. The world of Elvis tribute artists is vast and varied. Some are professionals who make a living from their act. Others are amateurs who do it for the love of the music, but a small number of them are so good, so dedicated to their craft that they can replicate Elvis's voice and mannerisms with stunning accuracy. Consider the phone calls. To pull off the hoax, an impersonator would need two things: an intimate knowledge of Elvis's life and a voice that could convince a close friend. The knowledge could be acquired through the many books and interviews available. A dedicated researcher could learn about the John Burroughs alias, about private nicknames, and about personal stories. The voice is the harder part, but not impossible. There are impersonators who specialize in specific eras of Elvis's voice, from the raw rockabilly of the 50s to the deep baritone of the 70s. A talented vocal mimic could absolutely fool someone over a low-fidelity 1970s phone line, especially a person who is in a state of grief and shock. The 1981 audio tape is the strongest piece of evidence for the impersonator theory. As discussed, the singer Jimmy Orrin Ellis had a voice that was virtually indistinguishable from Elvis's. He was active and recording at the time the tape was made. It's highly plausible, if not probable, that he was the voice on that recording. It could have been a publicity stunt, a private joke, or part of a more elaborate and cynical deception. The motive could have been fame, money, or simply the thrill of being part of such a grand mystery. The impersonator theory also explains the sightings. A man who dedicates his life to looking and sounding like Elvis is going to be mistaken for the real thing. Some impersonators may have even encouraged the confusion, enjoying the momentary fame of being spotted. The theory is elegant in its simplicity. It doesn't require a massive conspiracy involving federal agents, wax dummies, and secret networks. It just requires one or two talented and mischievous individuals. Believers reject this theory, of course. They argue that no impersonator could capture the soul, the specific nuance of Elvis's voice. They say that a close friend or family member would know the difference instantly. They also ask why an impersonator would make calls from inside Graceland in the days after his death. That would require an accomplice on the inside, which brings us back to a conspiracy. However, if the calls from Graceland are dismissed as a fabrication, and the focus shifts to the later evidence like the 1981 tape, the impersonator theory becomes much more compelling. So, how many impersonators in the late 1970s had voices that were truly good enough to fool Elvis's own friends? If it was a hoax, was it the work of a single impersonator or a coordinated effort by several? And has any well-known Elvis tribute artist ever been credibly accused of being behind the calls? Number 5, why fake a death? For the theory to hold any water, there has to be a motive. Why would Elvis Presley, one of the most successful and beloved entertainers in human history, walk away from it all? Why would he put his family and friends through the pain of his death? The proponents of the theory offer several compelling and interconnected reasons. The first and most commonly cited motive is burnout and the crushing pressure of fame. By 1977, Elvis was a prisoner in his own home. He couldn't go to a movie or a grocery store without causing a riot. His life was a relentless cycle of touring, recording, and hiding. He was physically and emotionally exhausted. His health was deteriorating rapidly due to his diet and his dependence on prescription drugs. He was reportedly deeply unhappy with the state of his career, tired of singing the same old hits in Las Vegas. Faking his death was the only way out. It was a permanent solution to an unbearable problem, a way to finally get the peace and anonymity he craved. The second, more dramatic motive involves the mob. This theory, detailed by Gail Brewer Giorgio and others, suggests that Elvis had become entangled with a criminal organization. The story goes that he had worked as an undercover federal agent, helping the government build a case against a powerful crime syndicate. His cover was about to be blown, and the only way for the government to protect their star witness was to have him, and enter a form of witness protection. This theory explains the secrecy, the sealed records, and the alleged use of federal resources to pull off the disappearance. It transforms Elvis from a tragic victim of fame into a patriotic hero, sacrificing his identity for his country. A third motive is spiritual. Elvis was a deeply spiritual man. He spent thousands of hours reading books on religion, numerology, and the afterlife. He was searching for meaning beyond the material world. Some believe that he saw faking his death as the ultimate spiritual act. By shedding his old identity, he could embark on a new journey of enlightenment, free from the distractions of his earthly fame. The philosophical tone of the alleged phone calls and letters supports this interpretation. All of these motives paint a picture of a man desperate for an escape. The Elvis of 1977 was not the vibrant, rebellious youth of the 1950s. He was a man in crisis. Whether that crisis was big enough to drive him to such an extreme measure is the central question. Skeptics argue that while he was clearly unhappy, he was also a man who loved his daughter, Lisa Marie, more than anything. They find it impossible to believe he would have voluntarily left her and put her through the trauma of his death. This is often the biggest stumbling block for those considering the theory. The love for his daughter seems to outweigh any possible motive for disappearing. Like, if he was escaping the mob, why has no evidence of his involvement with the FBI or DEA ever surfaced? If he was simply burned out, could he not have just retired from public life without such a drastic deception? And could he truly have abandoned his beloved daughter, no matter how great the pressure? At number 4, did the official record get it wrong? Beyond the phone calls and sightings, there is another source of mystery, one grounded in official documents, the record of Elvis's death itself. Believers argue that the official story is full of inconsistencies and unanswered questions, starting with the death certificate. The original death certificate, filed on August 17, 1977, listed the cause of death as cardiac arrhythmia. This is essentially a generic term for an irregular heartbeat, not a specific cause. It's a description of what happens when the heart stops, not why it stopped. Dr. Jerry Francisco, the medical examiner who signed it, was immediately criticized for this vague conclusion. The autopsy was conducted just hours after Elvis's death, but the full report was sealed at the request of the Presley family. It remains legally sealed until 2027. This single act has fueled more speculation than almost anything else. Why seal the report for 50 years? What is in it that the family didn't want the public to see? The official reason was to protect Elvis's privacy. But for theorists, it was to hide the fact that the body autopsied was not Elvis's, or to conceal evidence of the faked death. And then there is the role of Dr. George Nichopoulos, known as Dr. Nick. He was Elvis's personal physician, and he was the one who prescribed the vast quantities of drugs that Elvis was taking. In the 2 years before his death, Dr. Nick had prescribed thousands of doses of narcotics, amphetamines, and sedatives to Elvis. Many believe that the real cause of death was a drug overdose, and that cardiac arrhythmia was a euphemism used to protect Elvis's reputation and to shield Dr. Nick from liability. Dr. Nick's medical license was later suspended, and he was tried for overprescribing, though he was acquitted. The controversy surrounding him adds a layer of doubt to any official medical statement about Elvis's death. Believers in the faked death theory use this confusion to their advantage. They argue that the official story is a mess because it's a lie. The cause of death is vague, the autopsy is sealed, and the doctor was unreliable. It's the perfect environment for a cover-up. They suggest that the plan was to create enough confusion around the medical facts that no one would be able to say for certain what happened, providing the perfect smokescreen for his disappearance. The inconsistencies are real. The cause of Elvis's death is still debated by medical professionals today. The decision to seal the autopsy has undeniably hindered a full understanding of his medical condition. While these facts don't prove he faked his death, they do show that the official story is far from simple and straightforward. It's a narrative with missing pages, and in those blank spaces, theories like the 17 phone calls are allowed to grow. Why was the cause of death listed so vaguely on the initial certificate? Was the decision to seal the autopsy purely to protect Elvis's privacy, or were there other motives at play? And how much did Dr. Nick really know about Elvis's state of mind and intentions in his final days? Number 3, what happened to the tapes? Evidence is only as good as its source. In the case of the mysterious phone calls, the most compelling pieces of evidence are the audio tapes, particularly the famous 1981 recording. But a crucial question often gets overlooked. Where are these tapes now? And what is their provenance, their chain of custody? For a piece of evidence to be considered credible in any investigation, you have to know where it came from, who has handled it, and that it hasn't been tampered with. The story of the Elvis tapes is murky on all these points. The primary source for the audio tape evidence is Gail Brewer Giorgio. She claims she was given the tapes by her confidential sources. She has released excerpts to the public, most famously in a TV special called The Elvis Files. These excerpts are what most people have heard. However, the original, unedited master tapes have been kept private. Brewer Giorgio has stated this is to protect her sources and to preserve the integrity of the evidence. But this lack of transparency is a major red flag for skeptics. Without access to the original recordings, independent experts cannot perform their own analysis. They can't check for edits, splices, or other forms of audio manipulation. They are forced to work with copies of copies, which degrades the quality and makes definitive analysis impossible. The chain of custody is broken from the start. Who recorded the call? How did they do it in 1981? How did the tape get from the person who recorded it into the hands of Brewer Giorgio's sources and then to her? Each step in that chain is a point where the tape could have been altered or fabricated entirely. The story relies on trusting a series of anonymous individuals. The 17 phone calls allegedly made from Graceland are even more problematic, as no recordings of these have ever been made public. Their existence is based entirely on anecdotal accounts passed to researchers. There is no tape to analyze, only a story. This lack of verifiable primary source evidence is the biggest weakness of the entire theory. A voice on a tape is powerful, but without the original tape, it's just an artifact in a story. In the modern era of digital forensics, an original recording could be analyzed in ways that were impossible in the 1980s. We could analyze the background noise for clues about the location. We could analyze the electronic signature of the recording device. But as long as the master tapes remain hidden, these questions will go unanswered. Believers argue that releasing the tapes would subject them to ridicule and unfair debunking from a biased mainstream media. They see the gatekeeping of the evidence as a necessary act of protection, but for anyone on the outside, it looks like a classic case of a story that cannot withstand scrutiny. If the evidence was as powerful as claimed, why not subject it to the most rigorous, independent testing possible? A definitive match would change history. Where are the master tapes of the 1981 recording today? Has any independent researcher not affiliated with the Elvis is Alive movement ever been granted access to them? And if no recordings of the initial 17 calls exist, can we ever treat them as anything more than unsubstantiated rumor? Number 2, has anyone ever confessed? If the 17 phone calls, the audio tapes, and the decades of sightings were all part of a massive hoax, it must have involved more than one person. Someone had to make the calls, someone had to create the tape, someone had to leak the stories to the press. A secret of this magnitude is hard to keep. Over the course of more than 40 years, it seems likely that someone's conscience or their desire for fame or money would have led them to confess. And yet, no one has. There has been no deathbed confession from a former Graceland employee admitting they made the calls. No sound engineer has come forward to say they helped Jimmy Orion. Ellis faked the 1981 recording. No tabloid journalist has written a tell-all book about how they fabricated the first sightings. The silence from the hoaxer side is deafening. For believers, this is powerful proof. They argue that the reason no one has confessed to a hoax is because there was no hoax. The events were real, the logic is compelling. Large conspiracies are notoriously difficult to maintain because humans are not good at keeping secrets, especially over a long period of time. But people talk, relationships sour, someone always has a reason to reveal the truth. The fact that the Elvis is Alive story has remained so intact without a credible insider coming forward to debunk it gives it an unusual resilience. However, there are other ways to look at this silence. It's possible the hoax wasn't a grand coordinated conspiracy. It may have been a series of unrelated smaller events. Perhaps one person, a prankster, made a few phone calls in 1977 and then never spoke of it again, amazed at the legend they had accidentally created. Perhaps Jimmy Ellis made the 1981 tape with one or two friends as a joke and found it more beneficial to his career to remain mysterious than to confess. Perhaps the tabloid sightings were just cynical inventions by journalists who are now retired or have passed away. If the hoax was decentralized, there is no single person with the whole story to tell. There is also the possibility that a confession has been made, but not believed. Imagine a man in a bar in the 1990s claiming, "I was the guy who made those Elvis calls." He would be dismissed as a crank. Without proof, a confession is just another story. The myth has become so large, so powerful, that it would take more than just a person's word to dismantle it. The lack of a confession remains a tantalizing piece of the puzzle. It forces us to confront two unlikely scenarios. Either a group of people have kept one of the biggest secrets of the 20th century for over 4 decades, or the story is, in its essential parts, true. The absence of an admission of guilt leaves a space for belief to flourish. Why would someone with such a monumental secret take it to their grave? Could a confession have been made privately to the Presley family and been kept under wraps to avoid further scandal? Or is the simplest explanation the most likely that there is no hoaxer to confess? Number 1, what if it was all just a story? After all the analysis, after picking apart the evidence, the motives, and the theories, we are left with one final question. What if it was all just a story? Not a lie, not a hoax, not a conspiracy, but a story. A modern myth. The story of the 17 phone calls is not really about phone technology or voice analysis. It's about our relationship with death, fame, and the icons we create. Elvis Presley was more than a man. He was a cultural force, a symbol of rebellion, beauty, and excess. He changed the world. And then he died in a way that felt small and sad and deeply human. The story of his survival is a way to fix that. It's a collective attempt to rewrite the ending of his life. In the story, he doesn't die on a bathroom floor. He cleverly escapes, he takes control, he becomes the hero of his own spy thriller. It's a much better ending. It's the ending a king deserves. The details of the Mythy the 17 calls, the John Burroughs alias, the sealed autopsy way, are the plot points. They are the facts that make the story feel real, the details that allow us to suspend our disbelief. We tell and retell these details not because they are proven, but because they are good story elements. They make the legend richer and more compelling. Gail Brewer Giorgio may not have uncovered a conspiracy, but she undoubtedly wrote a masterpiece of modern folklore. This story serves a human need. It gives hope. It suggests that death is not the end, that a clever person can beat the system, that our heroes don't have to leave us. In a world that often feels chaotic and meaningless, a story like this provides a sense of order and mystery. There is a secret plan. There are clues to be found. We, the fans, can be the detectives who solve the case. It gives us a sense of purpose and a connection to the legend. The act of believing is a way of keeping the conversation with Elvis going. And perhaps, in the end, whether the calls were real or not doesn't matter. Their power is not in their factuality, but in their impact. They have created a community. They have inspired art, music, and literature. They have kept the memory and the mystery of Elvis Presley alive and relevant for new generations. The story has taken on a life of its own, becoming as much a part of Elvis's legacy as Heartbreak Hotel or Suspicious Minds. It's the final encore, the one that never ends. So, have we spent all this time analyzing a piece of history or a piece of fiction? Does the truth of the story matter as much as the meaning we find in it? And what does it say about us that decades later we are still so willing and so eager to pick up the phone and listen for the voice of a king who is supposed to be gone?